The billionaire's unlikely bride, a house of stone, a heart of gold. His coffee cooled in his penthouse office, overlooking a city he owned. He was a ruthless billionaire, about to marry for convenience, utterly convinced emotions were a weakness. What he didn't know, that on his wedding day, he'd discover he had 3 children he never knew existed, and his chosen bride, a quiet housekeeper, would shatter his world and rebuild it with love. Imagine learning you're a parent to identical triplets on your wedding day. Where are you watching this from? Let us know in the comments. Don't miss this incredible story of a life turned upside down by a shocking secret. Subscribe now and like for more stories that will leave you speechless. Every morning, Chloe woke before dawn. Her tiny rented room barely fit a mattress, an old chair, and a small wooden table where she made her diluted coffee. Since she was 17, she'd worked as a housekeeper for families who barely acknowledged her. Her life was a routine of endless effort, chores, and ensuring every space shone, all without the attention she deserved. Chloe's mother always said work brought dignity. For Chloe, though, her dedication barely allowed her to survive. Daily, for 40 minutes, she traveled to a vast estate in the city's outskirts, a majestic house with marble floors and chandeliers that swayed like celestial bodies overhead. There, she worked tirelessly, unseen in an environment alien to her. Her hands, rough and cracked, showed the years spent improving the lives of others. In stark contrast, the mansion belonged to Richard Vance. At 30, Richard had cemented his status as a successful magnate and billionaire through tireless dedication in the construction sector. His imposing height, distinguished bearing, and penetrating gaze, even behind high-end sunglasses, commanded respect from all. He believed the world revolved around him, or so he thought. From his exclusive office, overlooking the entire city, multi-million-dollar deals were sealed and life-changing decisions made. Yet the residence he inhabited showcased his isolation. No pictures hung on the walls, no welcoming warmth permeated the air. Richard saw life as a continuous battlefield, relationships as mere distractions. He'd always been a man focused on reality, believing the solution to everything lay in formal contracts and agreements. People were just pawns in his strategy. Even among his closest friends, who often envied his achievements, they mocked his lack of emotional maturity. Chloe and Richard's lives were diametrically opposed. She was content with her meager earnings, living hand to mouth, unlike him, who amassed fortunes without knowing how to enjoy them. While she trusted in the kindness of others, he valued only their utility. However, fate, in its unpredictability, makes no distinctions between the rich and the poor. Suddenly, everything changed on a normal day. As she performed her usual tasks, Chloe quietly cleaned the main living room. Richard entered, walking with determination, and watched her intently, not with the disdain he usually showed colleagues, but with a curious interest. He then posed a surprising question. "Have you ever considered marriage?" Startled, Chloe dropped the cloth in her hand. Her heart suddenly leaped in her chest. She thought Richard was mocking her, yet his expression remained impassive. "I don't understand, sir," she replied, feeling anxious. Richard moved to a leather sofa, took off his glasses, and observed her closely. "It's simple. I'm looking to marry. You seem trustworthy. I prefer formal relationships and avoid emotional involvement." To Chloe, it sounded like something out of a dream. What kind of man proposed marriage to his housekeeper? Yet Richard didn't seem to be joking. That night, she couldn't sleep. Though the proposal was overwhelming, it was also appealing. Her mother used to say life sometimes presented challenges difficult to comprehend. A few days later, Chloe consented. Her desire wasn't for ambition, but because something inside her longed to believe she had the potential to transcend and not be just an unimportant figure in others' lives. The wedding was intimate and somewhat distant. Richard only invited a lawyer and 2 witnesses, no one else. Chloe wore a modest white dress borrowed from a friend. The moment the words were spoken, "I do. I accept." News of the curious union spread quickly among Richard's acquaintances and friends. In exclusive venues and private gatherings, his friends would openly snicker. "Richard Vance, a man of great influence, married to a housekeeper." Richard didn't even bother to correct them. He didn't care what others thought. For Chloe, however, each mocking glance or malicious comment felt like a burden on her back. She tried to hide it, but her eyes revealed her suffering. In the large house, the silence grew even heavier. Richard was reserved in his words, while Chloe often spent her afternoons alone in a corner of the garden. Despite now living in luxury, her heart remained empty. Unbeknownst to them, this marriage would initiate an unexpected change for everyone, even for Richard, who hadn't anticipated it. What do you think will be the biggest challenge for Chloe in adapting to her new role as Mrs. Vance? How will Richard's friends' mockery affect their unusual marriage? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're intrigued by this unconventional love story, hit the like button and subscribe for more chapters. The days after the wedding passed like an optical illusion. Despite being Mrs. Vance, Chloe still felt like she was merely an employee. The grand residence, with its empty rooms and endless corridors, was utterly silent. Every day, at dawn, she woke early, as if her body hadn't yet absorbed that she no longer had to follow a cleaning routine. She wore simple clothes, tied her hair in a braid, and wandered through the house. As for Richard, he remained true to his unchanging routine. At dawn, he left impeccably dressed and returned at night, with the fatigued expression of someone determined to achieve success at all costs. They barely exchanged brief conversations. While he ate alone in his study, Chloe dined by a window, watching the city lights in the distance. That afternoon, Richard returned home earlier than usual. In the backyard, Chloe was tending to a small, neglected rose bush she had discovered among the overgrown greenery. Despite suffering scratches on her hands from the thorns, she continued to work diligently. From the glass door, Richard watched her in silence, his brow furrowed. The image of a woman kneeling on the ground, dressed in a modest sweater and skirt, sharply contrasted with the mansion's impeccable elegance. Finally, in an imperious voice, he inquired, "What are you doing out here?" Looking up, Chloe observed him with a touch of fear. He rarely spoke to her without reason. "I noticed these flowers were wilting. I thought with some care they might bloom again," she replied, as she stood and wiped her hands on her apron. Richard chuckled sarcastically and dismissively. Without waiting for a reply, he said, "You became my wife to tend to roses?" He turned his back and walked away. A knot formed in Chloe's chest. Her humble, affectionate gesture was ignored, just like so many other times in her life. She returned to her room. Despite now technically owning the house, she never considered herself the rightful owner of any space and quietly closed the door. On this occasion, she ate nothing. She felt that to Richard, she was nothing more than an inanimate object, something he could overlook at will. In the following days, Chloe began to notice small peculiarities about Richard that others overlooked. She would watch his watch punctually every hour and avoided sitting in the main dining room, as if it pained him to look at the large, empty table. Sometimes, she would hear him pacing back and forth in his office in the middle of the night, like someone tormented by an unresolved dilemma. However, he never allowed anyone to discover his vulnerable points. Richard Vance's armor was impenetrable. One Saturday morning, Richard surprised her in the kitchen. As she prepared a modest breakfast of coffee and toast, he suddenly appeared, dressed casually, which was unusual for him. He asked neutrally why she hadn't asked the chef to prepare it. Chloe shrugged. "I'm not used to someone doing my work for me, and I enjoy cooking." After a brief moment of silent contemplation, Richard sat on the counter and took a slice of toast from the tray. Surprised, Chloe glanced at him. She had never seen him eat food prepared by her before. Richard commented, "Your life is quite simple, showing more interest than disdain." "Perhaps, but sometimes it's the simple things that are most appreciated," she replied softly, without looking at him. Richard chose not to reply. He finished his breakfast and left, but this time he placed the plate on the counter instead of just leaving it there. For Chloe, that tiny act represented a crack in his formidable shield. That afternoon, a group of Richard's friends suddenly appeared. Individuals in designer clothes and hollow laughs flooded the residence with an almost aggressive atmosphere. From her room, Chloe listened to the distant laughter. "What about your wife, Richard?" one of the men joked loudly, asking if she wasn't going to be introduced. Richard looked at them with a serious expression, something rare for him. To everyone's surprise, he said that Chloe was not someone to be put on display. "She's a person worthy of respect." After that awkward moment, Richard chose not to break the silence. For the first time, he felt he had protected something he considered more important than his prestige. Every word was carefully heard by Chloe. She felt an intense blush on her cheeks, a mix of shame and suppressed fury. In that moment, she realized that for Richard, she wasn't his partner, but simply an element to fill a void in his existence. As night fell, and the house again plunged into silence, Chloe decided to go out to the garden. Kneeling under the starry sky, she bent over the wilting roses and began to dig the soil with her hands. "Value lies in simple things," she whispered softly, as if trying to convince herself. From the second-story window, Richard watched her again, unseen by her. He couldn't understand this woman, or why he felt uncomfortable watching her in that state, vulnerable yet resilient. What he clearly understood was that something in his life was beginning to transform, though he still wasn't sure what it was. What do you think is truly holding Richard back from embracing the simple joys Chloe offers? Will Chloe's silent persistence finally break through his emotional barriers? Share your insights in the comments, and if you're moved by this quiet struggle, hit that like button and subscribe for more heartwarming transformations. The faint light of dawn illuminated the mansion. As always, Chloe rose before the rest of the house and went to the backyard. The roses, which she had carefully tended, were beginning to show tiny green shoots. Although it seemed insignificant to some, for her, it represented a ray of hope. "In my experience," she murmured, "I've learned that good things take time to develop fully." As she pruned dry branches, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and found Richard standing there, hands in the pockets of his gray suit, watching her with an enigmatic expression. "Back out here again?" he inquired, not disapprovingly, just with interest. "I can't help it," Chloe explained calmly, her eyes serene. "Plants aren't in a hurry to grow, but with dedication, they make it." Richard looked at her for a few more moments. Then, in silence, he walked to a nearby stone bench and sat down. This surprised her. He had never shown interest in staying near her. Chloe returned to her work, trying to ignore his presence. Suddenly, breaking the silence, he asked, "Why did you agree to marry me?" In an instant, Chloe stopped and looked at him. The question surprised me, as I thought it had a special meaning. "Perhaps I could consider a change," she replied honestly. "I believed everyone deserves a chance to find happiness." A bitter smile appeared on Richard's face. "Chloe, Do you believe in happiness? Indeed, it's not something you receive as a gift, but it's found in the simplest details, in a home, in a family, she said softly. Upon hearing the word family, Richard frowned. He stood up abruptly from the bench, as if the words had burned him. Don't speak of things you don't understand, he replied coldly, then turned his back and walked towards the house. Chloe watched him go, experiencing an indescribable melancholy. Despite his efforts to appear strong, there was a certain fragility about this man. She chose not to press further. However, the conversation left a feeling of uneasiness within her. At dinner that night, Chloe mustered the courage to address the matter that had been circling in her mind since morning. Richard ate his dinner in complete silence, as was his custom, focused on his plate without looking up. In the immense dining room, the silence was so absolute that the slight sound of cutlery clinking was clearly audible. Have you ever considered being a father? She asked carefully, interrupting the tranquility. Richard paused, cutting his meat, and slowly raised his gaze to her. With an intense stare, his gray eyes, as cold as metal, settled on her. Never, he replied curtly. Chloe continued asking, though her voice trembled slightly. With an energetic gesture, Richard dropped his fork, the sound of metal echoing on the table. It's not possible for me to have them, he stated firmly, his voice cutting. I can't have children. However, as he spoke, a slight uncertainty crept into his thoughts. What if the diagnosis you received years ago was incorrect? He shook his head to dismiss the idea. It's absurd. With a firm expression, he reflected that it didn't change the situation. Chloe remained silent, shocked by the situation. The answer she received was not what she expected. Richard sat back in his chair and, for the first time, looked at her with a mix of anger and sadness. Many years ago in my youth, I received a medical diagnosis. I cannot be a father, so don't mention the idea of forming a family or vain hopes, as I don't understand them, he added in a softer tone, but with a hint of bitterness. Chloe felt a tightness in her throat, not out of compassion, but from the melancholy she detected in him. This revelation clarified many things: his lack of warmth, his distance, his indifference to everything related to love or the future. I apologize, she whispered. I didn't know that. He interrupted her with a reassuring gesture. You don't have to apologize. That's just how things are. Firmly, he asked that the matter not be mentioned again before standing from the table and leaving without finishing dinner. Chloe remained in her seat, alone in that vast dining room, sensing that the wound in Richard's heart was deeper than she had supposed. That night, trying to fall asleep, Richard's words kept echoing in her head. It was incomprehensible to me how a person could bear so much anguish, and at the same time, erect such impenetrable barriers around themselves. Despite the difficulties she had faced, she had never stopped believing that something positive could happen. Determined not to let fear or sadness define her existence, she promised herself to try to bring a little joy into that home. She would strive to show Richard, who was destined to remain in the shadows, that there was still reason to have faith in the future. The next day, Chloe returned to the garden. Despite its small size, the roses continued to unfurl their blossoms. A sweet smile touched her face as she murmured softly, "Patience is needed to achieve good things." She didn't imagine that her patience and faith would be challenged so unexpectedly. What new revelation or obstacle do you think will test Chloe's unwavering patience? Will Richard's cold exterior finally begin to crack? Share your predictions in the comments. And if you're captivated by this quiet struggle, hit that like button and subscribe for more profound moments. The days in the mansion continued with the same monotonous routine. However, Something had shifted in the relationship between Richard and Chloe after that conversation. He spoke less frequently, and when he did, his words seemed precisely calculated, as if he feared each comment might reveal more than he intended to show. For her part, Chloe remained silent, though a noticeable change was perceptible in her gaze, a serene resolution that began to perturb Richard. That morning, while he was in his study reviewing documents, he heard something sliding outside. Richard frowned with annoyance at the interruption and went out to investigate. In the hallway, Chloe stood, struggling to move a wooden table towards a window in the main living room. He asked in an annoyed tone, "What are you doing?" Chloe paused and gave him a kind look, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm arranging the living room to let in more light. The darkness in this place is so intense it feels like a tomb." Richard replied brusquely, asking who had told her to do that. "No one," she responded calmly. "However, if I'm going to live here, I want it to be a welcoming place, and it would be beneficial for you to share that desire." Richard's expression reflected astonishment, as if the words he had just heard were incomprehensible to him. It seemed ridiculous to him to think of transforming this grand house into a habitable place. For him, the place held no meaning. It was just an empty, practical area showcasing his success. Finally, he told her to leave the table where it was and walked to his office. However, Chloe did not comply. As he closed the door behind him, she continued to rearrange the furniture. By midday, the curtains were gone, and sunlight flooded the living room, revealing corners that had long remained in shadow. Upon entering, Richard frowned. He questioned in his usual commanding tone, "Who do you think you are to do this?" Chloe calmly replied, "No one told me, but if I'm to live here, I want it to be a real home." Richard didn't respond immediately. He looked around the room for a few moments, as if the place were unfamiliar to him. The idea that this place couldn't be considered a home crossed his mind. Without a word, he turned and left. However, that night, as he wandered alone through the residence, the memory of the illuminated room resurfaced. In the windows, Chloe had placed small potted plants and dusted the shelves. When finished, the atmosphere exuded a sense of cozy familiarity. That evening, Richard passed through the living room again. Suddenly, he stopped dead, observing the transformation. The sun's rays illuminated the delicate golden accents on the ceiling and the patterns on the marble floor that he had forgotten. He took a deep breath, as if something heavy had shifted within him. However, his pride prevented him from acknowledging it. "Don't change anything else without my authorization," he said coldly, without looking at her as he continued walking. Although Chloe didn't reply, a look of happiness reflected on her face. Days later, Chloe began placing small surprises in places Richard often visited. Before leaving for work, he would enjoy a steaming cup of coffee in his office, where he'd find a book on the table with a note. Sometimes, solutions are found in simple stories. Small details, but with great importance. At first, Richard knew nothing. He couldn't understand why Chloe continued to show him so much affection, despite having made it clear that the marriage held no significance for him. However, as time passed, something began to change. Each time he found a cup of coffee or a note, he felt a warm sensation in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Returning home unexpectedly that night, he found her in the kitchen. As she cooked, she hummed a soft song. The scene was simple, yet something about it made him pause. From the doorway, he watched Chloe gently stir the contents of the pot, as if cooking were a ritual for her. Suddenly, he broke the silence with a question that surprised her. "You always take things so calmly." Surprised, Chloe looked at him and smiled. She said that throughout her life, she had learned that rushing gets you nowhere. "Would you like to have dinner?" There was a brief pause from Richard. He never ate dinner at home. For him, food was simply another task, something he did in expensive restaurants without experiencing any enjoyment. That particular night, inexplicably, he sat down at the kitchen table. Chloe placed a bowl of hot soup in front of him. At first, Richard looked at it with doubt. But with the first spoonful, the simple, comforting taste evoked forgotten memories. When he was little, his mother often cooked him soup. Everything changed when his family broke apart, and he had to grow up quickly. "You pretend everything is all right, that your existence here has a purpose," Richard said, looking intently at her as he put down his spoon. Chloe inhaled deeply and held his gaze firmly. She expressed her conviction. "I believe everything can get better if one tries, even in this situation. You think you're alone because you chose to be. But in reality, that's not true. What you need isn't outside Richard, but within you." The words struck Richard like a stone. No one had dared to speak to him like that in so long. No one had managed to pierce his armor. He suddenly stood up and left the kitchen in silence, showing no anger, but an unavoidable concern. As she cleared the table, a sweet smile appeared on Chloe's face. She was aware of Richard's complexity, but she knew that like the roses in the garden, he only needed patience and dedication to fully bloom. Will Richard finally face his emotional wounds and allow himself to heal? What unexpected challenges will arise as Chloe continues to bring warmth to his desolate life? Share your predictions in the comments. If you're on the edge of your seat for this silent transformation, hit that like button and subscribe for more profound changes. In the mansion, time moved more slowly and serenely. Although he wouldn't openly admit it, Richard was beginning to perceive the transformations that Chloe's presence was bringing to his daily life. This woman, who walked silently and spoke tenderly, was managing, without expecting reward, to fill the empty spaces he had chosen not to see for a long time. However, Richard, always true to his character, preferred to remain reserved, as if afraid that showing closeness might make him vulnerable. Meanwhile, Chloe continued to show her dedication, patience, and persistence in her work to revitalize the place. Now, flowers were beginning to bloom in the backyard, while the main living room no longer had its previous gloomy atmosphere. Nevertheless, inside him, something was beginning to transform, though he couldn't yet identify it. While cleaning the small library of the mansion, she felt an intense pain in her abdomen. She put her hand to her stomach, trying to ignore the discomfort, and continued with her tasks. However, after a few minutes, the sensation returned, now with a slight dizziness that made her sit on one of the sofas. Richard suddenly entered. "What are you doing, Chloe?" Although his tone was firm, his furrowed brow hinted at a flicker of concern. She looked up with a forced smile and told him she was just taking a short break. She felt a bit dizzy. Richard looked at her disapprovingly and asked why she didn't ask someone else to do that task. "You're not staff anymore," he replied, showing more irritation with himself than with her, that she should stop acting like she was. "I can't act differently," Chloe responded calmly. Richard looked at her for another moment before turning and leaving in silence, without a word, though that scene remained etched in his memory. There was something about her that was unusual. Seeing her paler than usual, he experienced a new and uncontrollable feeling for the first time. Concern for her. In the days that followed, the dizzy spells increased in frequency. Chloe tried to hide them, but Richard began to notice. While arranging some vases in the living room one afternoon, she felt an intense discomfort that forced her to lean against the wall to stay upright. At that precise moment, Richard entered. "Chloe!" he shouted, rushing towards her. "I'm fine, sir, just—" She tried to answer, though her voice trembled. "No, "You're not fine," he replied firmly. "We're going to the doctor immediately." Despite wanting to resist, Chloe was forced to yield to Richard's determined tone. For the first time since they married, he took charge for a legitimate reason. After driving her to the nearest clinic, he didn't utter a single word during the journey. Meanwhile, outside, Richard waited nervously, standing with his hands in his pockets, while the doctor calmly examined Chloe. Despite not understanding why, the possibility of something happening to her caused him great anxiety. After a few minutes, the doctor came out of the consultation with a cordial smile. He invited Mr. Vance to enter. As he walked in purposefully, Richard crossed his arms and looked at Chloe, who was on the examination table with a doubtful expression. Seriously, Richard inquired about the situation. The doctor assured him that he shouldn't worry. "Your wife's health is excellent," the doctor began with a brief pause. "However, she is pregnant." At that moment, the world seemed to freeze. The words resonated in Richard's mind incessantly, like an infinite echo. He looked at Chloe, who was looking down, her hands clasped in her lap. "It can't be," he murmured, disbelieving. "It's impossible." The doctor calmly replied that he hadn't made a mistake. "The tests are clear. She's approximately 8 weeks pregnant. Congratulations." Richard felt breathless. He left the consultation in complete silence, walking down the hallway feeling an invisible burden on his shoulders. Chloe watched him leave, feeling as if her world was crumbling around her. Although the news deeply impacted him, he couldn't understand why he was unable to feel joy. The return home was completely silent. While Richard stared at the road with a serious expression, Chloe looked out the window, fighting back tears. Upon arriving at the residence, Richard exited the car and entered without waiting for her. Going up the stairs, he slammed his office door shut. She remained standing at the entrance, hugging herself, as the evening shadows lengthened. The silence in the house, which had often made her feel insignificant, was now unbearable. Slowly, she walked to her room and sat on the bed. She placed a hand on her abdomen, feeling a mix of fear and tenderness. With a soft whisper, she spoke words of comfort to the being growing inside her. On the opposite side of the house, Richard stood by his study window. As he watched the horizon, his thoughts wandered. He found it difficult to comprehend. For a long time, he had firmly believed that he couldn't have children, that he was incapable of being a father. How could it be possible if it didn't belong to him? Uncertainty began to invade his being, poisoning his mind and soul. With a clenched jaw, he whispered a resounding no. What's happening can't be true. That night, a silence reigned in the mansion, hiding the beginning of a storm. How will Richard confront Chloe about her pregnancy, given his past medical diagnosis? What will Chloe do in the face of his disbelief? Share your predictions in the comments. And if you're holding your breath for this revelation, hit that like button and subscribe for more intense moments. The first rays of sunlight barely reached the large house. Yet the day's atmosphere was thick with tension. Richard had remained in his office all night, sleepless, tormented by thoughts. The doctor's words echoed in his mind. She is pregnant. Instead of happiness, this news brought him uncertainty and anger. For a long time, he had firmly believed in his inability to have children, thinking he could never be a father. Now, unexpectedly, Chloe was expecting a baby. He couldn't understand it, and furthermore, he found it impossible to stop the growing suspicion in his mind. On the other hand, when Chloe woke up, her eyes were swollen from tears. It was clear to her that Richard didn't trust the miracle they had received, and this hurt her more than anything. Since their return from the clinic, he hadn't uttered a single word. As she quietly prepared breakfast, she heard his sure footsteps echoing down the stairs. Richard entered the kitchen, his expression grave and dark circles under his eyes. Leaning against the doorway, he crossed his arms and watched her intently. In a chilling tone, he expressed his desire for her to clarify the situation. She looked at him with a bewildered expression, holding a cup of coffee. "What do you want me to explain?" "Don't mock me, Chloe," he replied firmly. "That child can be mine." The cup vibrated softly in Chloe's hands before she placed it on the table. Her heart pounded so intensely it felt like it might burst from her chest. Richard asked her softly, trying to control his emotions. "What have you heard?" he continued, fixing his gray eyes on hers. "Years ago, I received a diagnosis. It is impossible for me to conceive children. So, could you tell me who the father is?" The words seemed to physically strike Chloe, making her step back. The intensity of the discomfort in her chest became unbearable. She watched him in astonishment, her eyes brimming with tears she couldn't stop. "Is that truly what you think of me?" she whispered, her voice choked. "How could I have disappointed you like that?" Richard was slow to respond. There was a brief moment of uncertainty. However, his pride and lack of trust urged him not to yield. His only request was to know the truth. Chloe took a step back, feeling how Richard's words hit her like a sharp weapon. It wasn't the first time her credibility had been questioned. However, coming from him, the impact was inexplicably painful. In the room that night, she hugged herself and allowed the tears to flow freely. She wondered how to trust someone who didn't trust her, her heart shattered. "You must know, Richard, that this child is ours," she declared in a raised tone, breaking her silence for the first time since they met. "I don't know what you think of me, but I would never betray you." In Richard, a mix of anger and disorientation seized him. He wanted to trust her, but it was impossible to ignore the years of convictions that were now crumbling. He left the kitchen without a word, leaving Chloe alone, her face bathed in tears, ready and done. A little later, Richard was at his longtime doctor's office. He had decided he needed answers with evidence that could confirm or refute everything. The doctor, an elderly man with round glasses and a calm demeanor, watched him seriously as he reviewed the previous diagnosis. "Richard, I understand your confusion, however. Let me explain something to you," the doctor said calmly. "It's possible that the diagnosis you were given years ago was incorrect. Not all tests are conclusive. The human body undergoes transformations, and reproductive capacity is not definitive." Richard's face showed surprise. He expressed his astonishment, asking if it was truly possible. The affirmative answer confirmed his doubts. The doctor stated that, though uncommon, it wasn't impossible. "If your partner is expecting a baby, it's very likely to be yours." Richard fell silent, feeling the tension in his chest gradually dissipate, replaced by an indescribable sensation. Was it a feeling of relief? He didn't know. At that moment, all he could understand was that he had made a grave mistake by questioning Chloe. Finally, he expressed his desire for more tests. "It's important to be sure, of course, but I would recommend that you have a conversation with her." The doctor firmly stated that although tests can provide the desired information, the connection with the patient is not based on documents. Returning to the large house, a sense of unease invaded Richard, something he had never felt before. He went to Chloe's room and saw her sitting on the bed, hands on her belly, staring at the floor. Upon seeing him enter, she barely looked up. He whispered Chloe's name, trying to find the right words. She quietly asked if he would accuse her again, avoiding his direct gaze. Taking a deep breath, Richard felt guilt overwhelm him. After so much time, he was speechless. He calmly approached and sat beside her on the bed. Finally, he murmured softly, I apologize. I was wrong. It was a mistake to question your word." Chloe didn't answer immediately. As her tears fell silently, her hands continued to caress her abdomen. "The baby is not responsible for your fears, Richard," she murmured. "If you don't want him, I'll take care of him alone." The words pierced deep into Richard's being, profoundly impacting him. He looked at Chloe's abdomen for the first time, and for a moment, he could envision the life developing within. This child was his own son. In his heart, there were no more uncertainties. "You're not alone, Chloe," he replied, his voice uncertain. "I assure you." Chloe looked at him with tears in her eyes, doubting if she could trust him. However, hearing those emotional words from a man who finally dared to be in his heart, she perceived a glimmer of hope. In that moment, they realized that this surprising revelation was a chance to restore what circumstances and suffering had damaged. What will Richard do to prove his renewed trust in Chloe and their baby? How will Chloe begin to heal from his initial disbelief? Share your predictions in the comments. If you're rooting for this family to find their way, hit that like button and subscribe for more heartwarming chapters. The days following that conversation felt different. Despite his lack of skill, Richard began to try and get closer to Chloe. The distant attitude he once showed her transformed into a calmer silence, without the same emotional burden. However, despite being ready to forgive, Chloe couldn't erase the hurt so quickly. The wound remained open, and every time Richard looked at her or tried to approach, she relived the cruel doubt he had shown her. That morning, Richard left his office earlier than usual and saw her in the garden, kneeling among the flowers she had carefully tended. The sun's rays highlighted her braided hair, while her modest outfit swayed gently in the breeze. The image left him momentarily speechless. Chloe's tranquility contrasted with the storm Richard had unleashed, causing him to feel a surge of guilt. With a gentle voice, he approached Chloe and spoke. She looked up without a word. Her face was calm, yet somewhat cool, as if she were guarding the last part of herself she hadn't yet shared. Kneeling beside her, Richard took her by surprise. To see a man like him, in his perfect suit and always proud demeanor, kneeling on the ground, was a scene she never would have expected. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he continued, fixing his gaze on her. "What I said and what I did are unforgivable. I made a foolish mistake." In silence, Chloe removed a dry leaf from among the flowers. He said that he doesn't expect to be forgiven immediately, but he wants her to know that he is ready to make changes. "I want to do better for you and for the baby." Chloe stopped her work and looked him directly in the eyes. After several days, she noticed a change in Richard. The man who had shamed her was not arrogant, but rather vulnerable, bravely confronting his own fears. With a soft but firm voice, she questioned him. "Why now, Richard? Why is this important to you?" Richard lowered his head and rubbed the back of his neck, trying to find the right words. He said sincerely, "I'm tired of living in the shadows. I always thought it was better to be alone, that I didn't need anyone's company. But you were the one who brought light into this home, and I didn't even realize how much light was needed." The words resonated in Chloe's heart, though she resisted yielding so soon. She said firmly and gently, "Richard, words are simple. What I truly need are actions. It's not enough to say it. You need to show it." Richard nodded, showing his willingness to face the test. He was aware of the difficulty of winning back her trust. However, for the first time in a long time, he was determined to try. In the days that followed, Richard underwent a gradual transformation. He stopped spending nights working in his office. Returning earlier from work, he tried to find reasons to be near Chloe. Sometimes he would watch her from a distance as she tended the garden, and other times he would venture to help her with minor tasks. Despite his lack of skill in simple activities like holding a shovel, he managed to elicit shy smiles from Chloe. On one occasion, he confessed, "I've never done manual labor in my life," while trying to prune a plant and ending up breaking a branch. A giggle escaped Chloe. "Clearly," she said. "However, Richard, no one is born knowing everything. The important thing is to try." That smile, though fleeting, represented a small victory in his life. Every time Chloe made a gesture or offered a quick smile, he got one step closer to his goal. One day, Richard arrived with unexpected news. He found her in the living room, sitting and crocheting a tiny white baby bib she had started to decorate with stitches. With some anxiety, Richard pulled out a small package wrapped in plain paper and offered it to her with these words, "This gift is for you." Chloe watched warily as she took the box and gently opened it. Inside were soft, handmade wool baby booties in a delicate yellow color. As she touched them, her fingers trembled. Richard mentioned in a low voice that he had ordered them. "I know I can't fix everything with gifts, but I wanted you to know that I'm starting to understand the importance of this situation." Tears welled up in Chloe's eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of emotion and relief. Although Richard didn't meet all her expectations, he was slowly moving towards a destination unknown to him. Gratefully, she whispered a thank you as she hugged the tiny shoes to her heart. With a faint smile on his face, Richard settled into the chair across from her. After several weeks, the shared silence was no longer awkward. He softly asked her if she believed he could ever be forgiven. Chloe looked at Richard with affection and sighed, explaining that forgiveness isn't given immediately. "If you continue this way, it's possible it will happen." Richard nodded, agreeing with what she said. For now, that was all he needed. As she returned to her sewing, Chloe left him there, silently watched by him. He had never considered the possibility of being a father or forming a home. But at that moment, he experienced an unexpected emotion: belonging. Richard Vance was beginning to feel that, for the first time, he could have a new opportunity in his life, and he was determined not to waste it. How will the growing love and anticipation for their baby continue to transform Richard's cold demeanor? What new challenges will they face as they prepare for parenthood together? Share your predictions in the comments. If you're invested in Richard's profound change, hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional breakthroughs. The arrival of winter was evident in the city, enveloping the mansion in a deeper silence. Through the old windows, the cold air seeped in, while the passage of time seemed to slow down, as if life itself awaited a crucial moment. However, inside the house, everything was beginning to transform. Slowly, Richard began to shed the shadowed figure he had been for so long. Mornings, once characterized by their coldness and solitude, now unfolded differently. Richard would spend time in the kitchen while Chloe prepared the first meal of the day. At first, he would observe in silence from the doorway, but over time, he began to help, though his clumsy attempts only elicited giggles from Chloe. "Like this?" he would ask, holding a knife with an almost childlike awkwardness as he tried to cut bread. She, amidst laughter, would reply, "If you keep going like that, you won't have any fingers left when the baby is born." After a long time, the house began to fill with simple moments, small gestures that lightened the atmosphere. Although Chloe didn't verbally express her forgiveness, her actions hinted that something inside her was beginning to heal. Richard perceived the situation, and despite not mentioning it, he felt he was moving in the right direction. Upon arriving at the mansion, Richard brought with him a surprise he had been preparing for several days. After talking with an old acquaintance, he decided to hire a team of carpentry experts to prepare a small space within the house. Upon entering the hallway that led to the old cellar, Chloe noticed something unusual. The door was ajar, and sounds emanated from within. Cautiously, she proceeded, and stopped abruptly upon witnessing what was happening. Richard was there, supervising workers who were assembling newly arrived furniture and painting the walls a soft blue. "What is this?" Chloe asked, surprised. Richard turned with his hands in his pockets and a nervous, almost innocent expression. "It's the baby's room?" he replied, glancing sideways. "I decided it was time to start organizing it." Tears welled up in Chloe's eyes, uncontrollable. She moved cautiously to one of the freshly painted walls. The smell of fresh paint felt almost fantastical. Richard, who had once accused her of disloyalty, was now there, preparing a place for the child whose existence he had rejected. With a whisper, she turned to face him and asked, "Did you do this?" "Only part of it," he commented, scratching the back of his head awkwardly. "I wanted to have this space ready for the baby's arrival." A faint smile appeared on Chloe's face as a tear rolled down her cheek. She whispered her gratitude, her voice filled with emotion. Richard approached cautiously, as if afraid to scare her. He said seriously that he was aware that she still hadn't forgiven him, but he affirmed that he was ready to do whatever it took to regain her trust. "I still don't understand this whole thing," he admitted. "However, I want to learn. I want to become an exemplary father." Observing Chloe intently, for the first time he perceived sincerity, remorse, and a genuine desire for transformation in his gaze. He wasn't the cold, distant individual she had previously encountered. He was a person who, like her, had begun to grow with dedication and patience. Richard murmured with emotion, "It's common to make mistakes, but the crucial thing lies in our subsequent actions." Richard nodded calmly. At that moment, he approached a little closer, and with unprecedented tenderness, he took Chloe's hand in his. She didn't pull away. That small gesture, though tiny, had great meaning, indicating that the distance between them was shortening. For the following days, the work never ceased. Although not very skilled with his hands, Richard helped with all aspects of decorating the baby's room. Shelves were painted together, tiny toys were organized, and modest patterned curtains were chosen. Though not expressed openly, Chloe felt a sense of peace within. Upon completing the room, Richard paused at the entrance and contemplated the achieved result. The place radiated warmth and vitality. In a corner, a white crib awaited its tiny occupant, and on the walls, small pictures with messages about love and family adorned the room. "I can't believe I participated in this," Richard murmured, crossing his arms. Chloe, smiling, replied, "You didn't do it alone," as she straightened a blanket in the crib. For an instant, Richard looked at her in silence. Chloe's serenity was evident, conveying a sense of calm that drew him to her irresistibly. In a gentle voice, he stopped beside her and thanked her for not abandoning him. With surprise on her face, Chloe looked at him. Brief was the moment when she glimpsed the possible transformation of Richard into an individual who, finally, was ready to embrace what life held for him. "Giving up on someone who longs to change isn't easy," she replied, giving a slight smile. "Perhaps you don't feel ready to forgive yourself yet, but I've already started to." Richard's heart, which had been so hard for so long, began to soften slightly. He placed a hand over his chest, as if compelled to breathe deeper. He experienced a new sensation of not fearing his emotions. Before speaking, Richard took a deep breath. Despite feeling a deep fear at the idea of becoming a father, something inside him, a long-forgotten feeling, motivated him to take the plunge. He doubted his readiness, but he committed to stepping up for the baby and Chloe. He decided to be the father the little one deserved, ensuring he wouldn't disappoint again. Chloe nodded sadly, allowing a solitary tear to run down her face. "You know it won't be easy, right?" Chloe said with a spark of optimism. "It's the motivation I needed." In that residence, once known for its lack of warmth, reconciliation spread through every corner thanks to the arrival of a new family just beginning to foot. What profound moment will finally solidify Richard's transformation into a loving father? How will their newfound family navigate the challenges of parenthood and past judgments? Share your hopes in the comments. If you're touched by their healing journey, hit that like button and subscribe for the beautiful conclusion. The advance of winter was evident, and the house, once cold and silent, showed a renewed appearance. Every corner and every room looked rejuvenated. Richard dedicated more hours to being at home, letting go of the image of an impenetrable man he had so carefully maintained. During the nights, while Chloe worked on sewing tiny baby clothes, he remained by her side in complete silence. Frequently, from his armchair, and with a cup of coffee in his hands, Richard felt a mix of nerves and optimism as the baby's birth approached. He had never considered the possibility of being a father, or even being responsible for another individual. But by observing Chloe, with her unwavering calm, something inside him assured him that he was capable of it. One night, he broke the silence by asking, "Do you feel scared?" Looking up, Richard frowned, as if the question had caught him off guard. He expressed sincerely, "I'm not sure. Sometimes I fear not being ready to face the challenges and making mistakes." As she continued her knitting, Chloe showed a sweet smile. "No one is born knowing how to be a good parent, Richard. Knowledge is acquired through experience and love." He nodded silently, allowing her words to have a significant impact. "I didn't grow up in a loving family environment." He was unfamiliar with the idea of family. However, being with Chloe, he began to think that perhaps he could change that situation. At dawn, Chloe woke up feeling a sharp discomfort in her abdomen. She sat calmly on the bed, inhaling deeply, when suddenly the contractions grew stronger. She woke Richard upon hearing her soft moans as he slept on the sofa by the entrance. He immediately asked what was happening, his face filled with concern. "It's time, Richard," she said, her voice breathless, gripping his hand tightly. Panic seized Richard's chest. However, he acted quickly. He helped Chloe to stand. He grabbed the coat he had prepared beforehand and gently led her to the car. Despite the intensity of the morning cold, Richard barely noticed it. All he could think about was getting to the hospital without delay. During the journey, Chloe's contractions intensified. As she inhaled deeply, she held his hand firmly. "Chloe, breathe. We're close." He repeated over and over, more to calm his own nerves than hers. Upon arriving at the hospital, Richard led her to the delivery room. At that moment, the helplessness he experienced was unprecedented. Watching Chloe face the most difficult and complicated moment of her life, he assured her softly that he wouldn't leave her alone, holding her hand as the medical staff prepared to begin the necessary procedures. "I'll stay here." With tears in her eyes, Chloe looked at Richard and expressed her trust with an affirmative nod. His words resonated with her in a way he hadn't expected. For a long time, he had been immersed in an environment where no one trusted him, except in business and financial matters. However, in that moment of extreme fragility, someone entrusted him with the most precious thing, the life of a being yet to come. The delivery process was prolonged and filled with pain. Richard remained in the hallway, pacing back and forth with his hands in his pockets, unable to be still. Every time he heard Chloe's cries coming from the room, he felt helplessness make him clench his fists. He felt for the first time that money and power, along with everything he had achieved in his life, were worthless if he couldn't ensure the safety of those he truly loved. After a long period of time that seemed endless, a nurse came out and called Mr. Vance to enter. Richard remained motionless for a moment, as if he had to process those words. Then he quickly went into the room. What he saw left him speechless. Chloe rested on the gurney, exhausted, but with a faint smile on her face. In her arms, covered with a white blanket, lay their baby. Richard stood a short distance away, unsure of how to react. With a tired voice, she called him, "Come closer, Richard. Meet your son." Cautiously, Richard slowly approached, as if afraid to disturb the delicate scene before his eyes. Gently, Chloe lifted the baby and brought him closer. With trembling hands, Richard held the tiny bundle, feeling an overwhelming lightness in his arms. He looked at the baby's tiny face, resting peacefully, and felt something break within him. It was his child. There were no uncertainties in his heart. "Your son is so small," he whispered, a lump in his throat preventing him from articulating words. "He is, but strong," Chloe replied, watching them both with affection, just like his father. Richard looked up at her, astonishment on his face. He felt for the first time that someone saw him authentically. Not an ideal man or a wealthy magnate, but someone capable of giving and receiving love. He whispered thank you as he looked back at the baby, grateful to receive something he never thought he'd deserve. A faint smile appeared on Chloe's face, as if she had left behind the pain, uncertainty, and resentment that tormented her. After a long time immersed in his fears, Richard finally found clarity by holding his son and receiving Chloe's boundless love. In that moment, Richard Vance realized that happiness didn't require perfection. Simply being there, showing love to his loved ones, and cherishing what life had given him was enough. With determination, he affirmed, "I commit to being an exemplary father," as he looked at the sleeping baby. "I will always be there for you." In the hospital room, as the new day dawned through the window, Richard's life had undergone an eternal transformation. The arrival of his son had not only given him a family, but also marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. How will their lives change with the arrival of their new baby? What challenges will Richard face as he fully embraces fatherhood and a new definition of success? Share your predictions in the comments. And if you're deeply moved by their journey, hit that like button and subscribe for more heartwarming transformations. After the baby's birth, the dynamic in the mansion radically changed in the following days. The hallways echoed with the delicate cries of the newborn, breaking the long silence that had reigned for so long. Despite feeling exhausted, Chloe couldn't hide the joy that overwhelmed her as she held the baby in her arms, fed him, or rocked him until he fell asleep. Before, her existence was characterized by effort and uncertainty, but now she found a more significant purpose. In contrast, Richard stood out as a unique individual. From the moment he held his son for the first time, something transformed within him. He decided to shed the image of an invulnerable businessman and began to show vulnerabilities he had never explored. During the nights, he dedicated his time to helping Chloe care for the baby, learning to hold him correctly, to calm him when he cried, and to integrate into the small but loving family they had formed together. While the baby rested in his crib, Richard was in the main living room, reviewing work documents. Entering the room, Chloe carried a cup of tea and briefly watched him before sitting across from him. Gently, Richard looked up as she called his name. He looked up, and put aside the documents. "What's wrong?" She took a sip of her tea to calm herself before speaking. "I wanted to tell you something important. I know the past year was complicated for both of us. However, it's important to me that you know how much I appreciate your actions." Richard watched her in silence, letting her words wash over him. "I know I failed, Chloe," he stated honestly, "and I understand that I can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that I don't regret anything we've built together." Chloe offered a warm smile, which had always been her greatest virtue. "Me too, Richard." After that moment, a pleasant silence reigned, charged with complicity. For the first time, they both felt they were in sync, not just physically, but emotionally. The baby's birth did not go unnoticed among Richard's social circle. Friends who used to mock his relationship with Chloe now began to show interest. A few came to see him, others sent gifts, and some tried to re-establish the connection they had neglected. Richard, however, had changed, and was no longer the person who needed others' approval. In the afternoon, he decided to invite a few of his former colleagues to his residence. Despite feeling nervous, Chloe agreed to attend, aware of how important it was for Richard to display his new identity to everyone. Upon the guests' arrival, the mansion buzzed with activity. Chloe wore a discreet but elegant blue dress, holding the baby in her arms, with Richard by her side. They began by discussing usual work topics, but then focused on the family they had built. One of his colleagues said, with a friendly smile, "I never thought I'd see you this way, Richard. Say I'm happy." Looking at Richard, a sincere smile appeared on his face, something that hadn't happened in quite some time. He replied with determination that yes, he was, as he had finally understood what was truly important. Chloe watched with satisfaction as things unfolded. Richard no longer displayed the distant and cold demeanor he used to have. At that moment, he was ready to reveal his vulnerability, recognizing that his real success lay not in his ventures or wealth, but in the family he had built. At the end of the evening, when the guests had left, Richard and Chloe settled next to each other on the patio. The baby rested peacefully in his crib, while the gentle breeze carried a serene atmosphere. "Do you remember your wish to turn this house into a real home?" Chloe asked, interrupting the quiet. With his gaze fixed on the sky, Richard nodded. "I still remember it clearly. I never thought it was possible." Then, she continued, holding his hand. "Look what we've achieved." Richard gently squeezed her hand. "Without your help, Chloe, I couldn't have done it." He smiled, but remained silent. "You didn't have to." Both were fully aware that the journey hadn't been easy, but they were sure it had been rewarding. "Tell me about it." In the following days, Richard made a choice that would completely transform the course of his existence. He decided to leave behind some of the more demanding jobs that kept him away from home and shared part of his tasks with others. He chose to dedicate his time instead of his wealth for the first time. Returning home earlier than usual one afternoon, he found Chloe on the patio with the baby in her arms, surrounded by the flowers she had so carefully tended. He paused to contemplate the scene unfolding before him. There were his wife and his son, two individuals who had changed his existence in unimaginable ways. Chloe, concerned to see Richard lost in thought, asked if everything was all right. "All right," he replied as he approached to sit beside her. "I'm exactly where I want to be." Chloe smiled and rested her head on his shoulder as he caressed the baby's head. She asked what his next step would be. "I will do everything possible to protect both of you. True success for me lies not in my ventures, but in my family." On that starry night, with the winter breeze caressing them, Richard realized that he had finally found what he had longed for, a sense of purpose, a reason to begin each morning. He was no longer the individual obsessed with triumph, but transformed into a person completely dedicated to love. In that residence, in that patio, He had found, at last, the place where he belonged. What an incredibly passionate story. If Richard and Chloe's journey also moved you, remember to like, share it with your friends, and tell us your thoughts in the comments. We truly value your perspective. Of course, if you're not yet part of our community, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss future fascinating stories like this one. We'd love to know where you're watching this video from. Leave it in the comments section. We love knowing who follows us from different parts of the planet.